Is Russia a threat in the Arctic? What is happening with China? And what do we misunderstand about Russia in the region? I'm Serafima Andreeva, and here's what's new. Today we will be covering Russia in the Arctic, and we have a very special guest all the way from Moscow. Pavel Devyatkin, you're a senior researcher at the Arctic Institute and also affiliated with the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Hello, Pavel.
Hi, Serafima. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Thank you for coming. So, when we talk about the Arctic for Russia, what is it primarily? Is it domestic? Is it military interests? Is it an arena of economic interest primarily? How do you see it?
Yeah, for Russia, the Arctic is primarily an economic powerhouse. It's a critical driver for national wealth through resource extraction, through shipping, transport infrastructure, but it also has very important military and domestic strategic value. Economically, the region contributes approximately 7% to Russia's gross domestic product and 11% of Russia's exports, mainly from the export of oil, gas, and minerals. It's very important for Russia's energy security and role in global trade. Russia is trying to develop the Northern Sea route, but of course, after Western sanctions related to the war in Ukraine, Moscow is now pivoting to Asian markets with ambitious plans to transport the Northern Sea route into an international shipping route, an economic engine for the country by 2035 and beyond, according to Russia's Arctic strategic documents. Military aspects are connected. Russia prioritizes the Arctic because the Arctic is Russia's whole northern border, and so 53% of the Arctic coastline is Russian. For Russia, the Arctic ensures access to the Atlantic Ocean. It's the home to important deployments of nuclear submarines, air defenses, and this goes back to the Cold War when the North Pole was the shortest route for missiles and planes between the US and USSR. To this day, in the context of the US-Russia rivalry, maybe now US-Russia normalization of relations, the region is very important for military security. At the same time, the Arctic is very important for Russia's socioeconomic modernization. It's a region where Russia is encouraging its citizens to move to work in projects. It's very important for Russia to build infrastructure like roads and healthcare, education, support the local communities, including indigenous peoples. And so if you look at Russia's Arctic strategic documents, a lot of the security issues that Russia focuses on are related to domestic issues, so threats from inside the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. That would include a lack of infrastructure, a lack of social services, out migration, that is people moving from the north to cities south of the Arctic Circle, and then also the transformation of the environment because of climate change. The Arctic is very important for Russia's economy, for security, and role in the world. Russia portrays itself as a responsible Arctic stakeholder by consistently participating in Arctic cooperation, international projects, and actively participating in Arctic fora like the Arctic Council.
It's quite similar to the other Arctic states in terms of that the domestic is the backbone of what creates the foreign policy. So my question is for us in the West, there is a lot of talk about particularly Arctic threats. And how much of a threat is Russia really in the Arctic? Has it become more of a threat up north after 2022? Or is it stable?
Definitely, Russia is a serious strategic actor in the Arctic. I mentioned the submarines of the Northern Fleet, long-range aviation, a whole system of air and coastal defense around the Barents Sea, around the Bering Strait, and of course, it's an important region in the standoff between NATO and Russia. But the central mission for Russia's military security strategy is to protect and defend this region. A lot of analysts have talked about the bastion concept. Rather than Russian military posturing in the Arctic set there to mount an offensive, it's there to protect its massive Arctic coastline and to put up its military assets as a defensive move against the challenge posed by NATO. it's, the Arctic threat is often overstated in Western academic media and policymaking discourse. You should look at how Russia's Arctic footprint is constrained by by resource constraints. You could see how since 2022, Russia has sent much of its local ground power to the Ukraine war, most notably the 200th the two motor rifle brigade and other units. So this reduces the conventional land armed presence in the Russian Arctic. Naval and air assets remain largely intact. But of course, Finland and Sweden joining NATO in 2023 and 2024 have increased the pressure for Russian policymakers to increase their presence on the Finnish border and in the European Arctic. But in general, Russia's military buildup is focused on reopening Soviet bases that had been abandoned or neglected during the 90s. During the 90s, Russia was facing a socioeconomic crisis, and Russia didn't have the resources to focus on the Arctic, together with the unfolding socioeconomic crisis and wars in places like Chechnya. So Russia has been conducting exercises in an effort to restore and modernize its presence and to make sure that it remains a great power in the Arctic, which is an important region for Russia because of the economic, social, security reasons that I've mentioned. The war in Ukraine has diminished Russia's focus on the Arctic from a military security perspective. And in general, we see that yes, there's a long-term competitive risk. There is, of course, going to be competition between the West and Russia in different areas in the Arctic. But after the ongoing conflict, we could see this trend of the defensive moves especially solidifying.
Thank you, Pavel. And one thing that I think about then is that you describe these military actions or defense actions, and what we can see is that the Arctic is not one theater. So while the Bering is different, we can see in the Barents that activity around their Barents bastion, their nuclear fleet, has concentrated way more on the domestic, and they've been a lot less challenging in the European Arctic. Do you have any comments on that after 20 days?
Yeah, the Barents Sea is the setting for a unique cooperation between Norway and Russia. Norway and Russia have had a long-standing rivalry, of course, in the Barents Sea, but because of the need to cooperate in areas of common interest, primarily the co-management of fisheries, the co-management of their common land and sea borders, there's still the critical and crucial communication channels open there between Norway and Russia. And the state of military activity in this region, I would say if you looked at the situation in the summer of this year, and I wrote a piece about this for the online magazine Responsible Statecraft about an ongoing standoff between NATO and Russia in the Barents Sea. We saw how U.S. Naval vessels had entered the Barents Sea for the third time in the past 5 years, and before that had only been entering this region since the Cold War. We see the U.S. operating with Norway, getting dangerously close and to Russia's backyard, to Russia's Arctic border. Reconnaissance drones and strategic aviation being deployed to northern Norway and approaching Russia's border. And then in response, Russia sending its own nuclear armed and nuclear capable submarines to meet and monitor these NATO warships. We see Norway building a strategic partnership with the UK with the explicit aim to counter Russia in the far north. So we see that there are examples of increased military activity which are dangerous, and this is a tit for tat where NATO officials look at Russian activities and explain NATO's exercises and need to build up based on a response to Russian activities. And Russia does the same by looking at NATO and the expansion of NATO to Finland and Sweden as a rationale for Russia expanding its own activities in this region. At the same time, we've also seen how Finland and Sweden have signed bilateral defense agreements with the United States. And that has opened up the possibility of increased deployments of U.S. troops, missile defense, and possibly even nuclear weapons to the territories of these countries. So far, that has not happened, and some analysts in the West and Russia believe that this is related to U.S. President Donald Trump's desire to draw down U.S. armed force presence in Europe and to focus on threats related to China or the southern border of the U.S.
Are there any misconceptions that you want to clear up about Russia in the Arctic?
Yeah, so there's several misconceptions about Russia in the Arctic. I'd say first, the idea that Russia dominates the Arctic is kind of overstated. Of course, Russia controls over half the coastline, has a huge icebreaker fleet. Its Arctic population is quite sparse. Only about less than 2% of the total population of Russia is in the Arctic. Development is still hindered by the harsh conditions and underdeveloped infrastructure. Also, I would say viewing the Arctic as a coherent security region where conflict is just impending and that melting ice is leading to this impending conflict and accessibility of resources, that's also quite a myth. I mean, not only is the Arctic not a coherent security region, as we discussed the differences between different parts of the Arctic, whether it be the European Arctic, the North Pacific Arctic, or if you want to call it the Bering Strait or the Barents Sea, different parts of the Arctic have different security dynamics. So this idea of an impending new Cold War, an impending war in the Arctic comes up still again and again in media and discourse from policymakers and academics. But this idea has largely been debunked by experts who note that there's a lot of diplomacy and negotiations that still goes on. There's a legal framework that informs this diplomacy, and the security actors in the Arctic, despite there being risks of escalation, there is an understanding that the security dynamics are largely of a defensive nature in response to each other. So that climate change does not explain these political and security dynamics. Rather, these are related to more global issues. So I'd finish by saying, there's this error to portray Russia's Arctic policy as only focused on military aspects, especially after the pause of the Arctic Council. Russia has been very much focused on socio-economic development of its own Arctic region, and scientific cooperation went into a very negative situation after the pause. And so now Russia is more focused on its domestic situation, which includes increasing its own scientific understanding of the way climate change is affecting the Arctic.
You mentioned the Arctic Council because Russia has added the Arctic Council back to their, I don't know if it's published now at the time of speaking. I'm pretty sure it's the unpublished draft of their Arctic strategy. Does this mean that Russia wants to cooperate with unfriendly Arctic states again, suddenly? Why?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, as of today, beginning of December 2025, the drafts to the new Arctic policies have been submitted to the government, but their texts have not been published. The last published revision of these strategic documents in 2023 removed some mentions of the Arctic Council and focused more on bilateralism. In those strategic documents, the Arctic Council was always mentioned as the key regional format for cooperation, but in that particular section, when it comes to multilateralism, that language has been changed. What is clear is that Russia remains open to cooperation with Arctic and non-Arctic states, and this could be multilateral. We see that Russia paused its funding to the Arctic Council, but has continued to participate in working groups, even though only virtually. But this cooperation with unfriendly states could be at a bilateral level, and here I'm talking about only the United States. So Russian foreign policy over the past several months, you could sum it up as, Russian foreign policy towards the West in the past couple of months, you could sum it up as cooperation with Europe, no. Cooperation with the United States, maybe. And so we see how the Alaska summit between Presidents Trump and Putin, we saw discussions of Arctic cooperation there. We see Putin's presidential envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, proposed this idea of a tunnel underneath the Bering Strait from Chukotka to Alaska. We see the emerging Ukraine peace plan, the 28-point plan, which now I think is a 19-point plan, but includes a point on Arctic cooperation, specifically on rare earth minerals. But this is all done in a purely bilateral context. Russian-European relations have been quite dire, but U.S.-Russia opportunities for Arctic cooperation, and the U.S. is regarded as an unfriendly country. Still, U.S.-Russia cooperation in the Arctic is still something that is of interest to Russia.
The Northern Sea Route, I mean, this has been an investment project for Russia for quite some time, since the Soviet Union, you could say. But they are dependent, as you also mentioned, on China to make this happen. When it comes to these China-Russia relations, how strong are they really? How does Russia view China as an Arctic partner?
Yeah, so on icebreakers, Russia's icebreaking development is largely domestic. We're not going to see Russia buy an icebreaker from China, even though China is interested in its own domestic development of icebreakers. On the Northern Sea Route, Russia does rely heavily on China for funding, for technology transfer, for being the primary source for cargo or the target for natural resources. So their partnership is quite important, and also in high politics, where we see Presidents Putin and Xi Jinping discussing growing Chinese-Russian trade and joint development of natural resource projects, joint development of the Northern Sea Route. We see their ministers also discussing this. It's not at the top of their agendas, but of course, it's there as an aspect of broader Chinese-Russian relations. So for China does provide financing and industrial inputs. We see Chinese ships leading and when it comes to international participants on the Northern Sea Route in the past few years. At the same time, sanctions create risks for China and make Chinese companies quite cautious. We see companies leaving Russia and Russian Arctic projects. We see these national petroleum and overseas shipping companies declaring force majeure and leaving the Arctic LNG projects, which cause risks for Russia's Arctic projects. And so politically, in general, Moscow welcomes Beijing as a partner in the Arctic, but at the same time has a sovereignty-first nationalistic perspective when it comes to the management of the Northern Sea Route. And so this creates issues for China, where China is not as involved in the Arctic as it could be. And Russian and Chinese businessmen and diplomats and experts that I speak to acknowledge that the cooperation in the Arctic between these two countries is not at the level that it could reach.
Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been amazing. I've learned a lot. It's been really great to have you on this podcast, Pavel.
Thank you very much, Sedefrima. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.